Okay, we got a challenge for Eric Bissell to see if he can encapsulate a little discussion in 10 minutes, which I doubt he can do. Lenore, what's the question?
Oh, the question is that some people have been deriding the sacred name cultus, and I wanted to know if you had any thoughts on the matter.
Well, the sacred name is generally referred to as the tetragrammaton. That's a Greek word, that tetra meaning four, and grammaton, where we get the word grammar, which is, or the word graphic, which is literally anything written. So there's 4 symbols that are written down. Tetragrammaton. And there's some people that apparently stumble across the significance of this 4-letter name, but then they revert back to, there's a Talmudic, you might say, a stigma against using the sacred name. And people have different reasons. There's something in the Talmud that says after a certain, whether the guy was a Cohen or a prophet, or what was he? You remember, Terry, that he died and then they stopped using his name after that?
Exactly. It's in the Talmud, and they say after a certain time they can't use his name because it's actually commanded not to, which is totally against
Scripture. But the thing is, according to
tradition.
According to a tradition, or according to those who honor some Jewish authorities, say absolutely don't use the name.
Right.
So that's fine. That's fine. If somebody doesn't want to use the name, there's no big deal. I'm not trying to say if you don't use the name, you're in big trouble, or if you don't use the name, you're going to hell, or if you mispronounce the name, then you should be castigated or stoned, or that you're not saved, or something like that. I mean, those words have been throwing around, and so some people are very dogmatic about saying the name must be pronounced properly because it was in that name that there is salvation. So I'm not even trying to suggest that if you mispronounce the name, then you don't find salvation. But some people say, well, what if you mispronounce the name to an extreme of, instead of saying Yahusha or Yahushua, that you say Jesus? Is that enough of a mispronunciation that you're not really calling on salvation? I'm not even really saying that at this particular time, but just let's look at the name. What is the name? So it all basically goes back to Exodus 3. So in Exodus 3, Moshe is out there herding his sheep, and he sees this bush on fire, but it's not being consumed. And he says, well, that's curious, out here in the middle of the desert. So he goes over, and now a voice is speaking to him from the burning bush. And that whole discourse. Then at the end of that, he says, well, who shall I say sent me? So when I go talk to the leaders of my people Israel, that they're going to say, well, who sent you? By what authority are you coming to us? In what name are you referring to these matters, to us? And he says, who shall I say sent me? The voice that came from the burning bush says, Ehye Asher Ehye. That's who you shall say sent you, Ehye. Well, just for a record, in Paleo-Hebrew, the word Ehye is aleph, hey, yod, hey. And then he goes on a couple sentences later to say Yahuwah is his Shem of Zakar. Well, that's yod, hey, wah, hey. They're spelled differently. This is aleph, hey, yod, hey, and this is yod, hey, vav, hey. He gave him 2 different names, but actually, when he first said Ehye, Asher Ehye, this is what he said. He said aleph, hey, yod, hey, Asher, which is aleph, shin, resh, and then Ehye again, which is aleph, hey, yod, hey. Now this is translated to say, this word here is translated as I am, and this word Asher is translated to be that, and then this is the same word again as over here, I am. And some people say, well, it's not really I am as much as I will be, And this word asher can mean that, who, or which, W-H-I-C-H. But asher also means straight. And it also means blessed. And it also basically means authenticate, or authentic, or to make valid. And then this is I will be again. So the translations that you might see in different scriptures might be, says, I am that I am, or I will be what I will be. But then Yod-He-Vav-He is the Shem. Now the word Shem, just for the record here, is Shin Mem, and it means name, or fame, or renown. But it also is the word for simply there. As a location. So it's the Shem of Zakar. So I'm going to write the word Zakar here, which is Zion, Kaf, Resh. Now this word Zakar means to memorialize or commemorate or remember or of renown, but it's also masculine. So it's a man or a group of men or something having to do with masculine attributes. So if people say, well, how do you know that the Almighty, the Elohim, is male? Why do you refer to him as a he instead of an it or a she or a spirit? It's because his Shem-Zakar is actually, he's referring to a masculine attribute. Okay, but so now we have this discrepancy. What's Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh? Well, if the word Ehyeh has to do with something that just is, then you could say, graphically, you might describe it as just a dot.
Okay.
It's either there or it's not there. Whatever, that's it. It's just a dot. There's no real elaboration. And then you could say the word asher means straight, as in this straight line. And then there's this other dot. So you could say, in a way, if you were going to denote what does Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh mean, it's basically a dot, a straight line, and a dot. Well, there's a further study that we could talk about some other time, but to me this has to do with a picture of balanced scales. Here's a yoke, and here's scales, and here's a standing on something. When the scales are balanced, well, what does that got to do with Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh? Numerous times through the scriptures he says the way he does judgment is that he returns a man's way upon his own head. So whatever comes down is not arbitrary, whimsical, capricious. It's specifically what he said is what it's going to be. What you do is what comes back on you. When there's a certain word, mishpat, which is translated as justice or judgment or right ruling, and as he says, according to the measure you use, it's measured to you. What goes on this side of the scale comes back on this side of the scale until things are balanced. So his name or his disposition or his renown is that he is the balancer of the scales. What's here is going to be there. So one could say, well, if you call him Hashem, you could say, well, that's not a real name. Well, but it's invoking a disposition. What is his renown? Where is he at? He's at the guy who says, blessed are the merciful, for you shall receive mercy. The way you do something is what's going to come back. So when people say, well, he is the guy who says there's no law, we don't have to do anything. The law is actually the balancing of scales, which is to say, if you do the Torah, which is to say, emet and chesed, truth and kindness, righteousness, zadikah. But see, righteousness, the word zadikah also means victory, deliverance, and salvation. So if you want to be victorious, if you do mishpat, which is in order to make the scales balanced, then what comes back to you is the balancing of scales. And if you do truth and kindness, then the balancing of scales is what is going to come back to you is truth and kindness. And his Shem is the guy that sees to it that that's what happens. So the Shem of Yod-He-Vav-He, we could say and argue about, oh, it's the way you pronounce these four letters. The pronunciation of the four letters we could say has been lost. Certain fellow says, oh, there's one or two places where these 4 letters of Yod, He, Vav, He end up with some vowel points, so we know it's pronounced this way or that way. But you could say, well, as a word, the Yod as a prefix means He will, whereas the aleph as a prefix means I will, and then He, Vav, He means to exist, and Haya has to do with existence, so I will cause to exist, or He will cause to exist. You know, you could get into the definition, but to say Yod He Vav He could simply be read as He will cause it to be. Cause what to be? Well, His Shem is, even though that's His Shem of Zakar, of remembrance, He will commemorate His disposition or where He's at by use of that name. In fact, in Exodus 20, right after the 10 Commandments, what He says is, in all places that I, now this word is either allow or cause, my name to be remembered, that's the word Zakar, there I will come to you and bless you. So those who say, don't worry about His name, miss out on whatever blessing He's going to cause or allow, permit. My take on it is to say, to recall where He's at, His Shem, His renown, is His doing to bring it to our memory. So the fact that there's even this contention is playing into this prophecy that in the future He would allow His name to be remembered. And if people say, stop using that name, they could stop using the name if they choose to. And if some people say, hey, it should be pronounced like this or like that, well, the question is, what does His name even mean? What is it that's being remembered? Is it the utterance phonetically, or is it where He's at? And if where He's at is the balancing of the scales, this is what I see. In the parashah of Mishpatim, which is Exodus 21 to 24, there's a whole list of this is the way things should go down between how you engage with one another. But also there, in part of that, is the Moedim, the festivals, the Shemitah, the 7-year land Sabbath, and the Sabbath day. That's part of the Mishpatim, the judgments that say, if you do this right, then this is what's coming back to you. If you do this wrong, then that's what's coming back to you, is the wrongness. So those who say there is no Torah, there is no law, they can do anything they want because they're under the blood of Christ. Right. If that's not true, that says there's nothing coming back at you. If it's not true that there's nothing that's going to come back to you because you're under the blood, then what this is saying is that as you continue to do unrighteousness, then what's going to come back to you is unrighteousness because you think, well, there's no law, it's not coming back to me. So I see you might say, the atoning purpose, or what's in the atonement of the blood, is to say you can be forgiven for what you've done wrong. However, even David was forgiven, but yet because he had Uriah the Hittite put to death on account of the Bathsheba incident, he was told that the sword would never leave his family lineage. There were still consequences to be paid. So the bottom line here is, if we do mishpat, right ruling, then the mishpat, the balancing of scales, is that what comes back to us is right ruling and victory and deliverance and zadikah. So that has to do with emet and chesed, which is to say doing the truth with kindness. That's where He's at. That what goes around comes around. You know, some other cultures call it maybe, and I'm going to invoke a word here that some people aren't going to like, but this notion of karma, or sowing and reaping, or what you do is what you get back at you. Maybe not right away, but ultimately it's your own way coming at you. In fact, there's a verse that says when you see your enemy approaching, it's actually your own finger going into the mirror until it touches itself. So if we see an enemy say, so this isn't fair, there's scriptures that imply it is fair. It's balancing of scales, and He's the guy that where He's at, what His Shem is making sure that what comes upon us is our own self in the mirror. And whenever we look at Him, it's almost like there's this big mirror up here where it's ourself coming back. There's a lot more to this subject, but what I'm saying is, if somebody's going to invoke the word Hashem, they're using, Hashem literally means the name. They're invoking a concept, not a name. If they squabble about how to pronunciate this word yod-he-vav-he, and other people have said, well, maybe it's actually aleph-he yod-he, that goes back to Exodus 3. And if somebody says there's no point in mentioning that, well, now they have to not argue with us. They have to go back and argue with Exodus 3. And then you can say, well, it really doesn't matter. Well, then argue with Exodus 20, where he says, this is the name that I will allow to be recalled later on. And there's numerous other verses regarding that. But let me just say this. Regarding, well, who is he then? Now, people have zitziot where they tie different knots which represent letters. You know, 7, 8, 11, 13, or 10, 5, 6, 5, which stands for yod-he-vav-he. But I would suggest this is the Shem of yod-he-vav-he. Here's a zitziot done with different colors, and this happens to be tied such that they're all 22 letters, starting off with 1, and then 2, and then 3, 4, all the way down to 22. So here's, you know, some people talk about, hey, who has the biggest zitziot? Here's a zitziot of Hashem.
It's a mile long.
This is the 22 letters. And so if somebody says, well, what's really his Shem? What's really his name? Where's he really at? He's the guy that is represented by each of the 22 letters individually and collectively. And so here's the Shem. Okay, here's the cult of Hashem of yod-he-vav-he.
Awesome.
Well, Eric, you're at 16 minutes. I knew you couldn't do it, by the way. As a matter of closing this, and there's variations, and I appreciate that people are at least trying to invoke his sacred name, not as a matter of judgment, but that people are trying. And the closest that I can come to, and this is kind of the crux of the video here, is Yahusha for Messiah's name and Yahuwah for the Father's name. Is that ballpark?
If I could show you one other thing. There's a certain state in the middle of this country.
I just can't get a yes or no on that one, can I?
Spelled I-O-W-A.
Yeah, this is cool. Yeah.
Iowa. Iawa. The Hebrew letter that is the I is the yod. The O sound could be a hey. The W is the vav. And then here's another ah sound, so I'm saying that, well, these two are the same letter. That could be a hey. Of course, if you read it the other way, that would be yod-he-vav-he. But also the word Hawaii, the E, if you read it Hebraically right to left, is the yod. The ah sound, again, could be a hey. The W, the wa, and then the ha could be a hey. So you could read Hawaii backwards as Iawa or Iawa.
That's pretty cool.
And then there's, as we mentioned, we were talking about, there's this Indian word up in Minnesota, Hi-Wa-Tha. And you could say ha, oh, that would be a hey. Iawa, that would be like yod, hey, vav, hey. Tha, well, that would be the letter tav, which is the sign of the covenant. So ha, yawa, tha, or tav, hey. Hiawatha could be read as the sign of the covenant of yod-he-vav-he, which would be Shabbat. So Hiawatha refers to Shabbat.
Really?
So in other words, there was also this Chinook Indian guy did a sculpture in Portland. It was titled "There It Is," and it was spelled W or Y-A-W-A, which would be the English transliteration of, in his own language, Yahweh, and it means there it is. Well, as we said, aleph-he yod-he and yod-he-vav-he literally means to cause to exist, as in there it is. The one who says there it is, you could say is Yahweh or Yahweh or Yahweh, Yahweh. There's a few different things, and perhaps, I've just suggested this as a perhaps, because his name is, people have heard his utterance and it sounds like the voice of many waters. Perhaps if everybody said it a little differently as they felt so inclined, all at the same time, with all these many human voices speaking the name slightly different, maybe that's really what it sounds like. But remember, he's the guy that gave it to us.
Right.
We didn't try to conjecture this or think it up. So for us to try to recall what it is or to listen to what he might put on our hearts is no profanity. It's actually trying to get back in line with what he actually gave us, to honor him, not to defile him.
Wow. Wow. That's awesome. Great way to end.
Good stuff, Eric. All off the cuff. Shalom.
Shalom.